In preparation for presenting our 2026 budget to the vestry this coming Tuesday night, I've been on the phone with all of our finance committee members and have been deep in the numbers this week. So this morning's sermon starts with a math test. Are you ready? What is 8 plus 8?
61.
What? Deacon Bill just said 20. Agreed, they don't cover this kind of stuff in seminary, but 16, right, great, you passed. Or at least by our current westernized post-Enlightenment standards, you passed. But if a first century Jewish teacher, later to be called a rabbi, asked the same question of their disciples, they'd likely get a different answer. Not because they mathed differently back then, but because they thought about questions differently. If asked what is 8 plus 8, a disciple worth their salt wouldn't say 16, but instead would respond with their own question. What is 4 times 4? Or what is 20 minus 4? Proving that not only do they know the correct answer, but that they see multiple avenues to get to the same result. The whole exchange between rabbi and disciple, between teacher and student, then went beyond parroting back a predetermined correct answer. By thinking about questions and answers differently, the ancient rabbinic art of questioning opened both student and teacher to a broader knowledge, to a deeper understanding of the issue at hand. So isn't it interesting the way this morning's gospel story unfolds? 2 of John the Baptist's disciples hear John proclaiming that Jesus is the Lamb of God, and they start following Jesus around. And when Jesus realizes that he has a tail, he turns around and he asks these 2 directly, "What are you looking for?" And how do they answer? Go ahead, look in your bulletin. How do they answer? With their own question. "Rabbi, where are you staying?" I don't think they're being rude. I don't think they're curious about how many stars the Verbo that Jesus has found has. I think they are, in fact, answering his question. And their answer is a change of allegiance from John to Jesus. Their answer is, "We want to be your disciples now." Their answer is, "We want to stay with you." What are you looking for? Where are you staying? And Jesus responds, "Come and see. Come and see." There's a beautiful audiobook / long-form podcast of Malcolm Gladwell's that you simply must listen to if you have not done so already. It's called Miracle and Wonder. Miracle and Wonder. Put that in your notes. Miracle and Wonder, and it's a compelling exploration of music and creativity through a long series of conversations with Paul Simon. At one point in the audiobook, as he is wont to do, Malcolm Gladwell seemingly veers way off course from the conversations in order to explain one of his theories about Paul Simon. In doing so, Gladwell talks about a book that he has read and studied called Old Masters and Young Geniuses. That book was written by a professor of economics, no less, at the University of Chicago, a professor named David Galenson. Now, the sermon at this point is going to become a bit of a thought experiment, so hang with me. In this book, Galenson is interested in the arc of artists' work over time, as measured by things like the prices paid for their paintings, or how often certain paintings are reproduced in textbooks, or how the critics viewed an individual artist's output over time. This economist, Galenson, offers his opinion that the artistic creativity of famous artists seems to fall into 2 dominant patterns. There are those artists whose highest valued work is at the very beginning of their career and who then go into decline. And there are those artists who produce a lifetime of substantial work, peaking at the very end of their careers. Among his case studies are Picasso and Cézanne, two of the most influential and famous artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Picasso created his highest valued work at the age of 26. Cézanne, however, created his highest valued work at the age of 67. Everywhere Galenson looked in the art world, he finds these two patterns, and so he concludes that there are prodigies and there are late bloomers, old masters and young geniuses. Thus, the title of his book. But then, yes, thank you, exactly. But then, Galenson asks a second and perhaps more interesting question. Is there a difference in the creative processes of the artists that fall into these two categories? And he discovers that there is. He calls prodigies like Picasso conceptual innovators. They have very clear goals. They begin with the end in mind. They work quickly and systematically. They map out everything in advance because they know where they're going before they even start working on a piece. Picasso, the planner, makes more than 400 preparatory sketches before painting his most valuable work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso is one of the young geniuses. Cézanne, on the other hand, doesn't work like that at all. Galenson calls artists like Cézanne experimental innovators. Their goals are broad and imprecise. They don't plan anything in advance, but rather work by trial and error and endless iteration. These creatives hone their skills over time because experimentation involves lots of dead ends. Galenson writes, and I quote, "The experimental innovator considers the production of a painting as a process of searching in which they aim to discover the image in the course of making it. They typically believe that learning is a more important goal than making finished paintings." So right about now, you might be thinking, this is all very interesting, Matt, but what in the world does it have to do with the gospel? I'm so glad you asked. Here is my answer to your question. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? The season that we are in as the whole church, the season of Epiphany, is all about God's manifestation in our lives, about new light shining in our hearts, as we'll pray in just a few moments at this table. The season we find ourselves in here at Christ Church is flowing in that same current. God is doing a new thing in our midst, taking all that has been and using it to create what will be. And our partnership with God in this mission begins with Jesus' question to his newfound followers. What are you looking for? When we hear stories like last Sunday's baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River or the calling of his first disciples, when we hear the stories of the beginnings of Jesus' ministry, of his powerful parables or his teachings that turn everything upside down, when we hear about Jesus spitting in the dirt and rubbing mud in someone's eyes so that they can see, or telling an immobilized person to stand up and pick up their mat and walk again, when we hear these stories about Jesus, we tend to put him in that first container. We tend to think of Jesus as a conceptual innovator. John's gospel would agree. Like Picasso, Jesus in John's gospel knows where he's going before he even starts. The end goal is very clear and mapped out. His ministry, his entire life then, is a series of sketches and studies that have a very similar look and feel that are all leading to the same masterpiece, the cross and the empty tomb. This is certainly a faithful understanding of Christ, one that much of our church's Christology is based in. But what if Jesus is Cézanne? What if his ministry and teaching, what if his miracles and healings are trial and error, iterations of a broad but imprecise goal? What if Jesus and his disciples are discovering the image as they paint it, discovering the kingdom of heaven as they practice it together? What if he doesn't know how it will all turn out in the end, and he works through it all anyway? Matthew, Mark, and Luke's communities tell of a Jesus who's more in that camp. A Jesus who doesn't have it all planned out ahead of time, but who creates the path forward with whatever he's got on hand. For Cézanne Jesus, the cross and the empty tomb are not some predetermined end to which all roads lead. Rather, crucifixion is a broken world's reaction to a radical prophet. And resurrection is God's love, even when God's creation gets it horribly wrong. This, too, is a faithful understanding of Christ. Now, many of us are probably more comfortable with John's version. If Jesus knows the end of the story before he ever steps foot in Galilee, he seems a lot less crazy. It's a radical road that he is inviting us on, one that demands a lot of us, to be sure. But at least he's in control of how it all ends. At least he knows what's going to happen. That feels much safer, much less risky. On the other hand, a Jesus whose whole ministry is a process of search and discovery and discernment, a Jesus who models a heavenly life through trial and error and elevates his disciples' growth toward the kingdom as the goal over some preferred product, that guy may be less predictable, certainly is potentially a lot more dangerous, but for some of us, that guy is a lot more approachable, more relatable, and therefore easier to follow. If your Jesus is normally Cézanne, perhaps it's time in this season of God doing new things to imagine him instead as Picasso. See how our beloved stories open up for you if he's following a divinely crafted script, carrying out the plans that he has already laid out, with the final masterpiece in mind. If your Jesus is normally Picasso, perhaps it's time in this season of God doing new things to imagine him instead as Cézanne. See how the gospel unfolds and hits you right in the soul differently if you imagine Jesus' teachings as multiple iterations of the kingdom as he discovers it. A master who is more interested in the learning that can happen along the way than in what the painting will look like when it's finished. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? How you answer that question will affect what you find. And if we can help one another remain open to encountering Jesus differently, we can be sure that God has surprises up both divine sleeves. Jesus, in the meanwhile, continues to call us, to invite us, to dare us. Come and see. Come and see.